This is the story of one man whose light was so bright that he helped many others find lights of their own. Today's story is called Victory Over Oppression.
Welcome to the very first holiday season of The Story. Season 5 features 8 stories of trailblazers paired with the beginnings of some of the most famous winter holidays ever. Season 5 of The Story is brought to you exclusively by Salesforce, the world's #1 customer relationship management platform. More than 150,000 businesses are using Salesforce to blaze their own trails to success. The Story is created by our team at Mission.org, a media company and podcast network.
The young man stood atop blocks of stone, battle hammer in hand. His armor was snug around his ribcage, and it provided more than just physical protection. It was engraved with the markings of his people. He stood atop a hill with his commanders, watching the battle unfold below them. He wished it had never gotten to this. War is not what he wanted. He yearned for peace, and so did his people. But under the tyrannical rule of the Greeks, peace was no longer an option. Antiochus IV, a Hellenistic Greek king, forbade any practice of beliefs that did not include the worship of Greek gods. Many in the kingdom were angry at the new rules. They did not want to be told what to believe in or who to pray to. The young man thought of his father, a rural priest named Mattathias, who warned him of this type of cultural oppression. Mattathias led a revolt by refusing to worship the Greek gods. The Greeks retaliated, and violence erupted. Soon the land was in chaos, and Mattathias had to escape. He led his 5 sons to the wilderness of Judah. It was there that the young man learned why his father demanded freedom. The young man learned that people should respect their rulers, but that respect should earn them freedom to worship. There should be no room for hatred or the oppression of any beliefs. Mattathias died a year after they had fled into the wilderness. With his father laid to rest, the young man returned to join the uprising. He rose quickly into a leader, thanks to his valor and military talent. His agile and quick forces were a stark contrast to the bulky Greek army. The young man knew that they could not beat the Greeks with formal military protocol, so they had to be cunning. Everything they believed in was at stake, and they had to use whatever advantages they had in order to beat the much bigger Greek army. As the young man stood atop the hilltop scanning the battlefield, he thought of all his people who had lost their lives over the years. His soldiers knew they were stepping into a battle they might not win. The young man knew in his heart that sacrifice was necessary to earn their freedom, but that didn't make the sorrow of loss any more bearable. His armor clanked with every movement as he made his way down the hill. At the base, he and his commanders broke into a run, weaving through the fighting and dodging enemy blades on their way to the temple. His eyes were fixed on the Greek general who stood at the top of the temple steps. This was the man responsible for defiling their place of worship. After making it through the battle raging at the base of the temple, the young man and his commanders fought their way through the general's guards. They ascended the steps, and soon the young man stood face to face with the Greek general. The 2 leaders clashed, and a blow from the general's shield sent the young man to the ground. Wheezing for breath, blood rushed from the young man's head. The Greek general raised his sword to deliver the final blow. In the young man's head, he remembered his dying father's final words. "If you let the Greeks win, you will lose everything." The general's shadow grew near, and the young man rolled away as the Greek sword clanged off the temple's stones. In the next moment, the young man was up and swung his hammer once, and the general fell. As quickly as the battle started, it was now over. The general lay motionless, and the young man with the hammer had regained control of their temple. With their general lost, the Greeks retreated. This day marked the end of years of war and struggle. The war had culminated into this single day of victory at the Battle of Emmaus. The young man and his people were one step closer to Judean independence. The young man who had led them to victory was Judah. His last name was Maccabeus, which in Hebrew means hammer. His people, who followed in his father's call for religious freedom, were called Maccabees. The story of the Maccabees defeating the Greeks was one of the first victories for religious freedom. It signifies that no one should live in fear because of their culture. This victory over the Greeks was commemorated in the restoration of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. To purify and rededicate the temple, the Maccabees needed oil, but supplies were low because of the war. They only had enough oil to keep the flames burning for one night. They lit the candles anyway, and somehow the oil lasted for 8 days. In that time, they were able to make more oil, and soon the flames were always lit in the temple. This celebration of eternal light is known today as Hanukkah. For many in the Jewish faith across the world, it is a time to reflect on spiritual journeys, the power of faith, and putting first the needs of others rather than our own desires. At times, it can feel like the constant hurdles and obstacles of life are too much to handle, especially during the holidays. We may question if we will ever see victory in the battles for freedom we have been fighting for years. Sometimes it feels like our personal or professional battles will never end. Will we ever find the victory and resulting peace we seek? The answer is yes, but only if we're brave enough to always continue fighting our battles. Over time, we may win certain battles, and maybe even our own personal wars against weaker versions of ourselves. Maybe those who inspired us to not submit to tyrants won't live to see us win the final victory. Maybe they will. Maybe we will fall, and our children will have to pick up the torch to find victory. In the end, what's important is that we never stop. You might only have enough resources or strength to keep the flame of hope lit for another 8 days. No matter what, keep the faith lit. You'll be able to figure out another solution in the meantime. Like Judah, it takes courage, leadership, and maybe a hammer-like mentality to overcome the challenges we face. No matter what the odds, no matter what or who you've lost, keep going and keep the flames of hope lit. That's his story. What's yours going to be?
Thanks for listening to The Story. If you love this and want more, tap subscribe to make sure you don't ever miss an episode. Thanks again to Salesforce for sponsoring this season of The Story. The Story is created by The Mission, your #1 source for accelerated learning. We send out a daily newsletter, operate a network of podcasts and shows, and our brand studio creates sponsorships that drive results for world-class companies like Salesforce. Subscribe and learn more at mission.org.